Hello everyone, today we are going to see about the tetralogy of Fallot. Here what are the four components of tetralogy of Fallot? First one is right ventricular hypertrophy, second one is ventricular septal defect, and the third one is pulmonary stenosis. The fourth one is overriding of aorta. So if you want a logical way to remember it, just think this is the left side, left atrium, and this is the right atrium, and this is the right ventricle. Here one of the component is pulmonary stenosis and ventricular septal defect. So for the right ventricle to pump the blood through the pulmonary artery, and as such the pulmonary valve is stenosed, that is when there is a pulmonary artery stenosis, then the right ventricle has to undergo hypertrophy to pump the blood, right? Therefore you can remember it as pulmonary stenosis, right ventricular hypertrophy, and to make conditions worse, that we also have a ventricular septal defect, where initially the blood from the left ventricle reaches the right ventricle. In this logical way you can remember these three components, and the fourth component is the overriding of aorta. Now is the next step in question. They might ask you which component is responsible for the prognosis. Which component is responsible for the prognosis of the condition? So out of all the four, what is prognosis is responsible? Here the pulmonary stenosis, the extent of the pulmonary stenosis determines the prognosis. So when the pulmonary stenosis is very severe, then the prognosis is poor, but when the pulmonary stenosis is mild or minimal, then the prognosis is good. So this is what the other question is about. Then sometimes they might ask you, why does the child squat? In tetralogy of Fallot, why does the child squat? So for this you need to remember the typical clinical presentation of tetralogy of Fallot. How will it be? A child around 10 to 12 years, they will be playing in their playground, and they will feel dyspneic and they will immediately squat. After a couple of minutes, their dyspnea will get settled and they will start to play again. So this will happen about 2 or 3 times in a 40-minute time period. So what is the reason behind the child squatting, and what is the reason behind the improvement of the feature, that is the dyspneic? So around what happens here is, in tetralogy of Fallot, there will be Eisenmenger syndrome that will be associated with Eisenmenger syndrome. I have a special video on it. You can, if you want to know about it detail, you can go through it. So in Eisenmenger syndrome, there will be reversal option. When there is a ventricular septal defect, then what should happen? The blood from the left ventricle will be entering into the right ventricle. During that initial phase, there will be no problem, because the deoxygenated blood is only contaminated with the oxygenated one, but whereas the oxygenated one is all good. But after a while, when the Eisenmenger syndrome is developed, which is reversal of shunt, that is when the blood from the right ventricle enters into the left ventricle, as that which happens in tetralogy of Fallot. So when the blood from the right ventricle enters into the left ventricle, again because of pulmonary stenosis and ventricular septal defect, the oxygenated blood in the left ventricle will be mixing with deoxygenated blood. So what happens? From the left ventricle, the blood has to enter through the aorta to all parts of the body, right? So the deoxygenated blood, that is the mixed blood, is now being supplied to the parts of the body. So similarly during that time, so therefore at that time, that is when the child is actively playing, he or she will be in need of more of oxygen. But what is being delivered? It is a deoxygenated blood is only delivered. Fine. Ordinarily it wasn't, she was able to manage, but now it is, now during play she is finding it difficult, so that she squats. So during squatting, because of the compression of the femoral vessels during squatting, there will be an increased left ventricular pressure. Because of the increase in the left ventricular pressure, the mixing of deoxygenated blood into the left ventricle is reduced, or it is stopped, such that what enters through the aorta is purely oxygenated blood from the left ventricle. Therefore, once the child squats, it increases the afterload and therefore increases the left ventricular pressure, and therefore it reduces or stops the shunt from the deoxygenated blood, and only oxygenated blood is delivered to the body. Therefore there is relief of her symptoms and she continues to play again. I hope this is helpful to you. Thank you for listening. All the best for your exams.